Hello, and welcome to today's University-based Child and Family Policy Consortium webinar. My name is Anna Kimura, and I am the Policy Assistant at the Society for Research in Child Development and the Consortium Coordinator. We're excited to welcome you to today's webinar, Best Practice Forensic Interviewing Guidelines, Implications for Questioning Immigrant Children. Before I turn things over to our speakers, I would like to say a few words about the consortium and about using GoToWebinar. Just a quick word before we begin about the technology we're using today. We are using GoToWebinar to host this webinar. All the attendees are muted and handouts are available to download from the sidebar. If you have questions for the speakers, please use the question box on your screen to submit them, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible at the end. Today's webinar is also being recorded. After it ends, the webinar will be uploaded to SRCD's YouTube channel, and we will share the link with all registrants. Please feel free to share the link widely as well. And now I am pleased to turn things over to today's panelists to begin their presentation.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Thank you, everyone. My name is Jodi Quas, and I am a professor of psychological science at the University of California, Irvine. I am absolutely delighted to be here with my colleagues, Dr. Thomas Lyon at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law, and also Ms. Carson Scott, also at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law. We are here today to discuss the implications of a very large and influential body of rigorous psychological science on forensic interviewing practices and their implications for questioning of immigrant children. And so before I talk about the implications for questioning immigrant children, what I wanted to do is I just wanted to stress kind of the significance of this work on forensic interviewing more broadly. This work has been pursued for the past 40 years in a very rigorous and systematic manner, and the impact has been enormous. As a result of this work, we now have very well-established best practice guidelines that are used around the globe for questioning suspected child victims and witnesses, many of whom have been exposed to abuse or violence and other forms of trauma. These protocols have been extensively tested with potentially traumatized youth, and there's even specific protocols for highly reluctant children, as well as checks to ensure the protocols aren't increasing errors and false reporting. Thus, as hopefully you'll see today, this work has multiple direct implications for questioning children in a variety of settings to obtain accurate and complete disclosures from them about their experiences. So next slide. Next slide. So I think a really useful way to start is to just stress the sheer numbers of immigrant youth who are being questioned in a range of legal settings. This graph simply shows you the number of children each month who are identified as unaccompanied alien children who are apprehended at just one of the US borders. This is the southwest border. So on average, there's between 3,000 and 4,000 children in this particular setting who are questioned each month. This is in addition to other children being questioned once they're here by ICE agents, also by the Office of Refugee and Resettlement, as well as children traveling with families who are nonetheless questioned about a range of topics. Thus, the number of children who are being questioned about a variety of topics concerning immigration is significant, demanding that we take a look at how these children are interviewed and how we can ensure that the information that they're presenting and providing is accurate and complete. Now, certainly just the sheer number of children shouldn't stress the kind of importance or the challenges that arise when questioning these children, but the context within which these children are questioned does raise a number of additional challenges. Next slide, please. So one of the challenges that is confronted by those who have to elicit information from these children concerns their history or their background. Many of these children, particularly those coming and showing up at the border, have left situations of potential extreme violence or abuse. They've oftentimes been traveling for days or weeks under conditions of very high uncertainty, not knowing where they're going to sleep, not knowing where they're going to eat, not knowing with whom they're traveling as groups may shift. All of this creates an incredibly uncertain and stressful kind of set of experiences for children that have direct impact on kind of how they're functioning, their trauma, and their coping. And those experiences have implications for how they're questioned. And just to kind of give you an example, lack of sleep alone, even if you kind of take everything else away, actually leads to significant cognitive and social problems. It leads to poor memory functioning in children, poor communication, high emotionality. I mean, kind of as a parent, you can all kind of think about what happens when your child doesn't get enough sleep on a day-to-day basis. Now, if you kind of exacerbate that with this uncertainty, these children are coming into interview settings and interactions with the authority in situations of already very challenging kind of circumstances. And all of this makes interacting with children in interview settings extremely difficult. And this is even before children are actually interviewed. Next slide. Now, this kind of history of trauma, uncertainty, sleep deprivation is then exacerbated potentially by the challenges of the interview context itself. So many children coming into these interviews may not understand why the interview is happening, why they need to be separated from parents or other adults with whom they were traveling. They may be afraid of authority figures. Even if you can overcome language barriers, there's still cultural barriers that may affect children's comfort interacting with or answering questions from adults in positions of authority. And certainly in many cases, kind of Customs and Border Protection may be questioning children in formal attire, kind of sending particular signals to children about the authority and status and the differential. Children may also not know why questions are asked, the goals of the interview, or what type of information is needed. All of this creates distress and confusion in children that can further inhibit their both ability and also their willingness to report information. Specifically, although kind of highly stressful events themselves are oftentimes remembered quite well, high stress during an interview situation can increase children's reluctance, reduces the amount of information that they're willing to share, and even increases their tendency to make errors in their reports. Thus, the stressfulness of the context itself when children are being questioned has a direct impact on what and how accurately children report information. Now, within all of this kind of, the stress from their history, the stress from the context, we still need to obtain a host of information from them. Next slide. Now, this is just a sample of some of the interview topics about which immigrant children might be questioned, depending on when they're being interviewed and by whom. So we need to find out how old they are, their country of origin. We need to find out their relationship to the others with whom they were traveling to ascertain whether or not they are should be labeled as unaccompanied minors. There's also kind of questions that focus on who the appropriate caregivers are to take care of you. For some children, credible fear interviews need to be conducted. So there needs to be some assessment of whether children fear persecution because of religious, political affiliation, possibly race or ethnicity, or their membership in a particular social group. There's also kind of important information that has to be gathered about whether children are at risk of being smuggled or trafficked both before and after entry into the US. Children's experiences of victimization by parents may also be of interest, and for children who are in contiguous countries, there's also the potential for their competency to waive entry that needs to be assessed. So all of these topics are crucial to find out from children despite them coming in with these levels of high stress. Next slide. Now, fortunately, as I mentioned, there is a massive and very influential body of rigorous scientific research that has focused on best practice interviewing guidelines. And certainly we can't go through all of this in a brief webinar, but what I do want to do today is kind of highlight some of these domains where we can have an impact in affecting children's comfort and increasing their reporting accuracy and completeness in reliable ways. Each of these three domains has direct implications for the questioning of immigrant youth. So these include the context, kind of the setting and the kind of situation kind of surrounding when children are interviewed, the questions asked, and the training of the professionals who are conducting the interviews. Next slide. So very briefly, when I'm thinking about context, I'm really thinking about kind of two types of factors. And this includes both the setting itself and also the demeanor or kind of the behavior of the interviewer, even before the specific questions are asked. So by interview setting, I mean, children's distress is reduced, their communication is improved, and errors decrease when they're in a positive, warm, and comfortable setting, as opposed to a setting that is formal, that's structured, and that's potentially kind of not child-friendly. So some examples of the types of settings that scientific work has tested as increasing children's comfort are things like letting children sit down in a comfortable chair rather than questioning them while standing. I mean, it's a simple manipulation, but it's also something that can be fairly easily changed to increase children's comfort. In addition, children should be fed and rested. This simply increases attentiveness. If children are expected to be able to listen to and respond to questions in a complete manner, they should have to be well fed and they should be rested. Otherwise, they're going to have considerable trouble. Whenever possible, interviewers would do better in plain clothes, as plain clothes are less intimidating than kind of formal uniforms. Finally, whenever possible, more than one interaction between a child and an interviewer can increase their familiarity and their comfort with an interviewer, and familiarity and comfort can reduce their tendency to err. Next slide. But certainly the setting isn't the only factor that's important. How the interviewer behaves is equally, if not more, influential. A large amount of scientific research has suggested that supportive interviewers are really valuable to children. They increase the likelihood of children actually disclosing negative, oftentimes traumatic experiences. They can also increase how complete children are in their reports, so children will provide more information, and supportive interviewing will decrease children's suggestibility, how easily they'll be manipulated by the interviewer. The supportive behaviors that can be used include verbal and nonverbal behaviors like maintaining eye contact, smiling, sitting close to and kind of a child, facing a child, rather than sitting far from and directly across the child from a table, nodding, using back channels or these ahas, okay, at consistent intervals throughout an interview. And finally, other forms of verbal encouragement, just acknowledging kind of the challenges and acknowledging that children are doing a great job trying, even if they're not providing highly valuable information. All of these types of supportive behaviors have been found to increase children's responsiveness and accuracy, and they're also fairly easy to be implemented into other types of interview settings to improve children's performance as well. So next slide. And with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Lyon, who's going to talk about the actual questions and how those affect children's reporting. Tom?
All right, thanks, Jodi. Hi, everybody. I'm Tom Lyon, as Jodi mentioned. I'm a law professor at University of Southern California. A couple of pictures that Jodi showed you before are actually good to take a closer look at. One is the Tell Me What Happened book. That's Michael Lamb and colleagues' extensive review of research, not only on basic research on children's skills in interviewing, but also the application of the NICHD structured protocol for questioning children. And what I'm going to do is borrow from a lot of that. Personally, I teach and train the 10-step interview, and it's really a simplification of the NICHD protocol that we teach in California. You'll also see similar recommendations emerging from groups like APSAC, the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children. And one of the things, and as well as Karen Saywitz's protocol, that's the other book that Jodi showed you a picture of, that all of these protocols agree about at least a couple of things that we know are effective for both increasing the productivity of children's reports and decreasing suggestiveness and error. And these two things are instructions and narrative practice rapport building. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the specifics of instructions and narrative practice, the way it works in the 10-step and in most other protocols. But at this point, let me just explain that the principles that underlie these two approaches are, first, that children are unaccustomed to interview situations, because interview situations are unlike other interactions that children have with adults. In a typical adult-child interaction, the adult person is the authority figure. They tend to be the knowledgeable person. Imagine a teacher-student interaction or a doctor-patient interaction. And in those situations, it's bad for the child to show ignorance. It's bad for the child to show incomprehension. The child should not contradict the authority figure. And so when children are put into an interviewing situation where the child is actually the expert and the interviewer is actually the ignorant ignorant member of the pair, it's a very different interaction. And so what interview instructions teach the child are that the interview situation is very different. And there's been a fair amount of research on each of the instructions, and I'll go into a little bit more detail in a minute, which shows that you can reduce the number of errors that children make if you give them interviewing instructions. Narrative practice rapport building is, I think, the single greatest innovation that interview researchers have come up with. And it builds upon this, commonsensical understanding that you probably don't want to immediately jump in and ask the child very threatening questions about their, interactions with others that may be abusive. They may have been trafficked, they may have been abused in their home country, they may be fleeing some sort of horrible experience. And that shouldn't be the very first thing you ask the child about when you sit down with the child to interview them. So that's the commonsensical understanding that you have to build rapport. But what narrative practice rapport building recognizes is that the way in which you build rapport will affect the productivity of the child's responses. And the principle, and can you go to the next slide? The principle is that you're going to, very early on in the interview, move towards open-ended questions. And the way to think about an open-ended question is that it looks for recall as opposed to recognition. You are not asking yes/no questions or forced choice questions. Those are recognition questions. But you're asking very open-ended recall questions that sound like, tell me everything that happened, tell me everything about, tell me more about something that the child has told you. And what we know, and this is based on research on actual abuse cases of children who are disclosing sexual and physical abuse, we know that both by using narrative practice rapport, which begins with these and continues with these open-ended recall questions, and by asking the child these open-ended recall questions about their abuse experiences, we increase the amount of information that children produce. And the reason why this surprised people when they first started to find this true in the research is that there was this general feeling that children are highly reluctant to disclose abuse, which necessitates the use of very specific and sometimes leading questions. And it was the move away from very direct leading recognition questions towards recall questions that really started to improve interviewing. The other side of the coin is that if you begin the interview with yes/no questions and you're asking the child about negative things, we now know that this decreases completeness and accuracy. So the notion that one needed to ask very direct questions about abuse was belied by the fact that if you ask a child a yes/no question, say, were you abused by your father? Not only does that strike many people as highly suggestive, but it is so easy for the child to say no that one actually sees very high rates of false negatives in cases where interviewers use very direct approaches. On the other hand, if one uses narrative practice rapport building in order to both get the child comfortable with the interview and increase the productivity of the child's responses, then it's possible to move towards the allegations. And in some cases, ask yes/no questions. But these questions are much more likely to be productive if the child has become comforted and become fluent through the use of narrative practice. And this last point, if yes/no questions must be asked, follow up with requests for elaboration. This is something that, and this was, I think, first developed by the NICHD researchers, Michael Lamb and his colleagues. They call it pairing. And the idea is that there are situations in which you may need to ask yes/no questions in order to elicit certain amounts of information from children. The point is that if you do ask these questions, you have to treat the child's answers with caution, and you can't accept a yes answer as sufficient. What you can do is if the child does answer yes, then you ask a very open-ended free recall question to follow up. So for example, if you ask the child a yes/no question and they say yes, you say, well, tell me more about that, rather than move on to another yes/no question. Can you go on to the next slide, please? Okay, so Carson Scott and I have been working on modifying protocols for interviewing immigrant children. And I should say that in our paper, we're very positive about the fact that there's a huge amount of research that shows that interviewing children is something that it's a skill that we can teach through extensive training, that we can elicit large amounts of information from children using free recall questions. But we should also acknowledge that virtually all the research has been done on children who are being questioned about abuse, predominantly sexual abuse, and that in most of these cases, children have previously disclosed before they're interviewed. And of course, that means that these children are unusually willing to disclose information about their experiences. And in modifying the interviewing protocols that have been used with sexually abused children and other kinds of abused children, one has to take account of the very significant differences that one's likely to see with immigrant children. Okay, but having issued that caveat, I can tell you that certain aspects of the protocols that have been developed seem like good adaptations for immigrant children interviewing. So the first 5 steps are the interview instructions that I mentioned just a moment ago. And this is actually taken from the 10-step interview, but these instructions are very similar to the instructions in the NICHD protocol and also similar to instructions that are recommended in the APSAC, the American Professional Society on Abuse of Children guidelines. And the instructions basically teach children that it's okay to say they don't know. It's okay they say that they don't know what the interviewer means, an easier way of saying I don't understand. It's okay to correct the interviewer, that the interviewer doesn't know the answers to his or her questions. And finally, and this is something that, that we've done a fair amount of research on, there's some evidence that children are more likely to be honest if they're asked to promise to tell the truth. Now, the exact wording of these instructions are actually quite important. And we've found that it's important to give the child examples so that the child recognizes that you really do mean it when you say it's okay for them to say, I don't know. So what researchers have found is that practice with the instructions, rather than simply telling the child it's okay, for example, to say, I don't know, are important. And you can find more details about this very easily if you look into the literature on protocols. Step 6 is that step that I've talked about, which is the most important step for increasing children's productivity. And the way this works is that one starts out by asking the child, tell me about things you like to do. But then what's key is to ask follow-up questions that will elicit a narrative response from the child. And so the way one would do that would be, for example, is you'd say, tell me about things you like to do. The child might mention different activities, say they like to play football. And in order to elicit a narrative, as opposed to simple yes, no, short answers, one would then say, tell me everything that happened the last time you played football. And the idea then is to move from short responses to long responses, where the interviewer is saying less and the child is producing more. One then follows up with tell me about things you don't like to do with a similar follow-up, and tell me everything that happened on your last birthday. And these questions have been asked in thousands of interviews. And what researchers have consistently found is that if narrative practice rapport building is used prior to asking children questions about highly sensitive topics, in one study, for example, the children were all disclosing sexual abuse, children will be more productive in the allegation phase, that is talking about abuse when after using narrative practice rapport building. And children's responses to free recall questions will be more productive if narrative practice rapport building is used. And it takes about 5 to 7 minutes. That seems to be the optimal time. Now, step 7 would be questions about potential relief. But this is where we have to acknowledge there's really little or no research that's been done on these specific questions. But what we can do based on the research is derive the kinds of questions that are likely to be most productive and least suggestive, given what we know about interviewing children in other contexts. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carson, who's going to tell you about the kinds of legal relief and then the kinds of questions that might be utilized for questioning children about potential relief.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carson Scott. I've been working with Professor Lyon for a little over a year now. I'm training on how to interview children using his protocol, and I also regularly volunteer on a weekly basis with Esperanza Immigrant Rights Project, interviewing unaccompanied minors about their legal claims, as well as translating in various contexts for them. So yes, I'm going to talk to you guys mainly about two things, the relief that's generally available to unaccompanied minors seeking relief in the United States, and then as well as some sample questions. And I do want to encourage you guys to start using the chat box to send us any questions you might be thinking of for us to answer at the end of the session. So generally, unaccompanied minors have 5 to 6 reliefs available to them. The first two I have on this slide, special immigrant juvenile status, or SIJS, and asylum, are typically the most common we see. So for SIJS, it's for those minors who have suffered abuse, abandonment, or neglect by one or both parents, and the minor is under the age of 21 and unmarried. So in your questioning, of course, you are going to want to elicit facts that go towards the elements of abuse, abandonment, or neglect, right? And this can be shown through things such as whether or not the child worked in their home country, was the child able to go to school, what sorts of resources were available to the minor, or was the minor lacking resources such as food, shelter, school supplies, and as well as the parent's habits. How did the parent discipline the child? Did the parent have any sort of drug or alcohol dependency? These sorts of facts are going to be relevant for the child's CIGIS claim. The other most common type of relief is asylum. So asylum is for those minors who are afraid to return to their country because they've suffered something severe back home, or they're in danger of suffering persecution in their home country on account of their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or their particular social group. And their home country is unable or unwilling to protect them. So, depending on in what context you work with the unaccompanied minor, eliciting information about all of these legal elements might not be necessary, but certainly if you are a legal service provider for the minor, you're going to need to find information that goes to each of these elements. And perhaps the most difficult part about establishing an asylum claim is the on account of the child's social group. This is a very difficult part of the asylum claim, and why interviewing with open-ended questions is so essential to elicit as much information, getting at what sorts of abuse or danger or harm the child has suffered in their home country, and any possible reason, whether it was they were persecuted because of their religion, they were persecuted based on their sexuality or their political opinion. So again, what kinds of things you're looking to elicit from the minor is what kinds of abuse they suffered, whether physical, emotional, and whether they fear returning to the home country, and what specific facts made them flee, or what facts make them fearful of returning to their home country. Next slide, please. So here are some other potential reliefs that are a little less common, but still very important to discuss with the minor, to question the minor about. T visa is for any minor who's been trafficked through the use of force, fraud, or coercion to provide labor or services, including commercial sex. So again, using open-ended questions to elicit why the minor has come to the United States, what has happened to them throughout the trip, and also about what their life is like here in the United States, to get at whether or not the child may be eligible for T visa. U visa is a little less common, only because it involves the minor or a family member of the minor having been the victim of a serious crime within the United States. So oftentimes many of us who are listening today perhaps have access to the child before they've had a chance to live extensively in the United States, or when the child is just first establishing their life in the United States, but still a relevant legal relief for the minor. And the last one I'll talk about briefly is family petition and VAWA. Family petition is for minors who have a mother, father, or a step-parent who is a legal permanent resident or a citizen of the United States, or the child might have a sibling that's over the age of 21 and a US citizen who can submit a family petition asking for legal relief for the child. VAWA's functions, VAWA also has to do with abuse. So this is for minors who have been abused by a parent or a step-parent, or perhaps the parent that they are now living with in the US has been abused by their partner who is a legal permanent resident or a citizen. Next slide. Great, so it's really important to be maximizing the openness of questions when talking to the minor, as we've heard from Jodi and extensively from Professor Lyon. So while we may be starting with open-ended recall questions, such as, tell me about living with your family, or tell me everything that happened when, it might be necessary to ask some more specific questions in order to explore the relief thoroughly. So it's important for the interview to follow up any answers the child makes with open-ended questions, so you can get at those specific details necessary to craft the child's legal claim. Next slide. Great. So here are some example questions that I'll go through that Professor Lyon and I have been working on together. So, in order to establish abuse, for example, for SIDGs, you might want to ask the child, what would happen when your mom or your dad would get mad at you? And then you can kind of pick up on one of the factors that the child tells you. Tell me more about dad yelling, or tell me more about whatever the child might have said that could potentially get at the element of abuse. We also suggest following up with what was the worst thing that happened, and how did you feel when, and what did you think when, to elicit more detailed information about what the child has experienced in their home country.
Yeah, and if I could jump in at this point, Carson. So the issue that we confront when we look at the standardized protocols that have been developed for questioning kids is, as I mentioned before, most of those cases, most of the sex abuse cases where the research is derived from, are cases where the child had previously disclosed. And so what researchers have found is that interviewers can successfully say to children, tell me why you came to talk to me today. And in most cases where children disclose sex abuse, they will disclose in response to that question. The problem is that if you're interviewing an immigrant child, you don't have a prior disclosure. Instead, you have to be conducting a very different kind of interview. It's what you'd call a screening interview. And then in order to ask good screening interview questions, one has to recognize that a direct question, a yes/no question, is likely to elicit a no response. And at the same time, a direct question will strike many as being potentially leading. So you might say to the child, has your dad physically abused you? And that would be both leading and would easily lead to a no response. And so what we've thought about is that, well, there are situations where in any child's life, the parent is going to get angry with the child. And so although this would constitute a suggestive question, it's a fair question. At the same time, that this isn't going to immediately elicit abuse information. And that's the reason for asking what was the worst thing that happened? Because to the extent that the child has suffered from potentially abusive behavior by a parent, worst can get at that. And the purpose of the how did you feel and what did you think questions is that these are questions that have been used successfully in cases, again, of sexual abuse. And what children's answers to these questions allow the interviewer to do is to get a more complete picture of the severity and the credibility of the child's report.
Can I also kind of jump in here and just, and kind of Tom and Carson, maybe elaborate, these questions on the one hand sound easy to do, oh, you ask a, yes, no question, then you follow up. And we do have a lot of evidence that they work, but it's also, I think, really important that interviewers are highly trained to follow these types of protocols. And Tom, I'm going to sort of let you kind of jump off of that and just talk a little bit about kind of how do we train interviewers to do this? Is it easy? Is it hard, et cetera?
Yeah, so it looks incredibly easy, and it's not at all. And so what the training research shows, and this is something that we touch on in the paper, is that the vast majority of training programs fail. And the reason for that is that it is quite easy to train interviewers to know what they ought to do, but it is very difficult to get interviewers to actually comply. And there are several reasons for that. The first reason is that the vast majority of our interactions with both children and with other people, we accomplish through yes/no questions. And so first one has to override just this strong impulse that interviewers have to ask a series of yes/no questions. And to wean them away from that requires not just education, but you actually have to have practice and feedback. And in order to maintain the gains that you do see in programs with practice and feedback, you have to have refresher courses. And so Michael Lamb and his colleagues published a study in which they found that monthly refreshers were what was necessary to avoid slippage, where interviewers would revert back to their bad habits of asking exclusively yes/no questions. The second problem is that in order for the open-ended questions to succeed, it's necessary for the interviewer to have done a good job of building rapport. And you know, that itself is difficult because, as you know, building rapport requires the interviewer to ask the child these very open-ended questions about their last birthday, about things they like to do. And it's hard to train people to do that. And the research shows that if children are not being responsive to those rapport building questions, then it is highly unlikely that the child is going to disclose or cooperate. And so interviewers have to be both do a great job of rapport building, which is hard to learn to do, but they also have to be attentive to the fact that if rapport building is not going well, they can't continue to interview the child and expect the child to give them complete information. Carson, maybe do you want to look at the last question, because we have just a few minutes before Q&A.
Sure. Yeah. So next slide, please. So here's an example of a yes/no question, and again, keeping in mind what Professor Lyon just said. So our question here goes to asylum, and it's thinking about maybe a gang-based claim, crafting a particular social group based around that, perhaps a political opinion or a gender-based particular social group. So have you had a problem with a gang member? So this is a very close-ended, it's a yes/no question. So very important to follow up. If the child responds in a manner that suggests they may have, tell me everything that happened. What's the worst thing that happened? How did you feel when? What did you think when? So again, as Professor Lyon was mentioning, and this will get at whether or not this will get at more details regarding what the child has experienced and whether or not there was any sort of abuse to help craft the legal claim.
Yeah, and if I can just add, of course, we want to emphasize that these specific questions haven't been tested. And so, you know, so the paper that Jodi and I wrote, we feel comfortable with saying that there's a great deal of research that has demonstrated how children can be effectively interviewed. But we have to remember that the contexts in which those interviews have occurred have many differences. And we definitely, this is as much a call for research as it is a review of best practices. It would be wonderful for researchers to get interested and involved with, you know, what are the kind of screening questions that could and should be used with immigrant children.
Maybe next slide then.
I think we're up to our 15 minutes for Q&A. Only I see a very silent. Do you guys also see a very silent chat box?
Yes.
We've answered all the questions people would conceivably have. I know there was a question. There was a pre-submitted question about the difference between adolescents and children, and that's something that we haven't talked about. Maybe we could talk about that for a few minutes. My sense is that the most notable thing about the interview protocols is that there aren't a lot of differences between protocols for interviewing adolescents and protocols for interviewing younger children. And the reason for that is that a good rule of thumb is to use language that is as simple and clear as possible, given the fact that you really have no idea when you interview a child, you know, what the child is going to understand and what they won't understand. And so that the easiest and simplest approach is to speak very simply. And the other part of that is that if a good interviewer is asking very open-ended questions, the vast majority of the questions that the interviewer is asking are, tell me more, what happened next, and questions that build upon the language that the child is using. And if you think about that, it's like, well, that means you're adapting your language to the child's language. And so it isn't necessary to say, okay, we have a pre-adolescent protocol and we have an adolescent protocol. There are some differences between the interview instructions. Typically, what interviewers will do with pre-adolescents is they will give children the feedback and the practice in order to convince them that they're serious about the interview instructions. Whereas with adolescents, one can drop the feedback because it feels a bit infantilizing. And so with an adolescent, one can simply say, it's okay to say, I don't know if you don't know the answer. But beyond that, there really aren't a lot of differences at this point.
No, I mean, eliciting, using open-ended questions or at least open-ended follow-ups and obtaining narrative information, kind of having children or adolescents talk is going to be effective across age.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I guess really a lot of the child protocols were inspired by cognitive interviewing, which was developed for use with adults. And so there's no reason to think that it's a radically different approach.
Are there other questions? I don't know if people post them. I think Anna, you will type them out or post them.
Yep, we're still waiting on questions from participants. So if you have any questions, please submit them in the question box that is in your sidebar. But I think we should just continue with some additional submitted questions, pre-submitted questions.
Oh, okay. One question was about language barriers, and I should stress that one of the reasons that Carson's been great to work with is she is fluent in Spanish, and I think an obvious, answer to the issues of language barriers is that we're assuming that interviewers are going to be able to speak to children in their home language, and if not, obviously that adds yet another layer of difficulty to communicating effectively. At the same time that it's that this approach of asking the child questions that build upon the child's report rather than using a lot of the interviewer's language, that will be more effective with the child who is less comfortable in English than it would than other kinds of interviewing approaches would. Carson, in your experience, do you find that do you find the language issue a challenge?
Not so much. So, as you mentioned, I'm able to interview children in their native in Spanish. It does get complicated sometimes when I have attended a few asylum interviews at the asylum office as a translator, and it is complicated serving as a translator because you're translating both the child's words and the asylum officer's words. So that is a pretty common way in which immigrant children are interviewed, I think, by government officials or any institutions that are there to provide their legal relief, like immigration court or the asylum office. So that can get kind of tricky. I think if you are an interpreter, making sure that or you work with a minor, making sure that the minor understands how the interpretation works ahead of time can really help make them feel comfortable and practice their pacing in terms of giving the interpreter enough time to translate what they're saying and vice versa.
Right. And I guess, and you've mentioned to me that a fair number of Spanish may be spoken at the same time that there is a native language that is not Spanish that often is difficult to accommodate. Is that accurate?
Yeah. Yes, that's correct. So especially with minors coming from Guatemala, sometimes Mexico, indigenous language is spoken in addition to Spanish, and that might be their stronger and preferred language. So that's often challenging for me when a minor is stronger in their indigenous language, such as Quiche or Ichil, to communicate with the minor in Spanish. But I think the good thing about the 10-step and the interview protocol discussed today is, as Professor Lyon mentioned, using as simple language and making the questions less complicated can assist in overcoming some of those barriers. But it is best if you have an interpreter available in the child's strongest language, it's always best to interview in that.
I do want to stress just one thing, that language is not exactly the same thing as culture. And so even if you translate questions and a child is comfortable in Spanish rather than kind of in a native or local dialect, that just translating into Spanish may not fully address kind of cultural differences and cultural expectations that can vary significantly. And so one of those domains are just in children's deference to authority, and different cultures kind of how they teach children how to defer to authority figures and how to answer authority figures. And so kind of paying attention not only to the language, are we using a simple language that children understand, but also being attentive to differences in how children's cultural expectations and the cultural norms may affect their comfort, their stress level, and even their sort of willingness to be an equal participant in an interview setting with an adult.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jodi. And similarly, when I've worked with interviewing children, I try to use the exact language that the minor is using, because there are linguistic differences in addition to cultural differences, right? Depending on whether the child comes from Guatemala or Honduras or El Salvador. So when asking those tell me more questions, making sure you're repeating the same variety, the same linguistic variety of the child, using the same vocabulary that the child uses in their response to the question, I think is really important as well.
You know, I noticed we do have some questions that have come up from listeners. This question, I have to admit, I don't know anything about. The listener says, I'm curious about supplementing interviews with trauma event questionnaires, such as the HTQ or TESI. I assume those are standardized interviews for getting at trauma. Any thoughts? I guess my question would be, what are the question types? Are they open-ended questions? Are they closed-ended questions? You know, what's the research on use of these questions with children? You know, some of the issues we've just described, the language, culture barriers. At the same time that I think we all would acknowledge that there's really limited research on the use of these interview protocols with children who are not, from other cultures, other languages, who are not accustomed to being questioned by adults. And so we just have to be very careful in recognizing that we're likely to elicit too little information in many of these cases. How about this one? Could asking about experiences with a gang lead to the child disclosing gang affiliation? Wouldn't this create a problem when they are seeking status in the United States?
That's, I guess my perhaps straightforward answer is, I think that just asking about gang affiliation would be a yes/no question, and you really need to follow up with the kind of the open-ended questions to find out the kind of context surrounding that affiliation, and kind of what that meant, whether the child had any opportunities not to be affiliated.
Yeah, Carson, with gang affiliate, I mean, I assume that if this is anything like the United States experience, that a lot of these children who do have asylum claims, they were probably pressured to join gangs. Is that not the case? Is it all a matter of them being persecuted by gangs but not being pressured to join?
Yeah, so from my experience in interviewing, a lot of it is it includes being pressured to join as well, which wouldn't actually be gang affiliation.
So it wouldn't undermine their asylum claim.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, there is a concern if the child did participate in any gang activity, there could be a problem with their asylum claim. But you know, for the most part, we see children fleeing being violence at the hands of gangs or being pressured to join and not wanting to join and being left with no choice.
Right, right. Here's a question. Do you have any handouts with question prompts that you would use in specific cases? And I can tell you quite honestly, we were moving in that direction, and then we stopped and we said, uh-oh, let's be more cautious in recommending specific questions. And the reason we do that is because, as I stressed when we told you about these questions, is that these have not been specifically tested. And so to the extent that we're focused on what research has demonstrated, it's really the best we can do is to suggest the kinds of questions that one might ask, but we're really hesitant to distribute question forms at this point. And this is as much a call for future work as it is, you know, saying we have the questions for you to ask.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, I can go back a little bit to Tom when you were talking earlier about some of the standardized questionnaires and some of these questionnaires. It's interesting. You know, I do know some of these, and some are actually for adults, and they're yes/no questions about events that have happened earlier. Some of them are for children, and they're usually coming out of kind of distress work or post-traumatic stress symptoms. And if you look at some of the models for them, they do begin with things like yes, no question, and then if a yes, here's some follow-up questions. I think that the difference is that the follow-up questions in a lot of these circumstances and on these other questionnaires are also yes, no, because they're screening items, they're clinical screening tests. And so to the extent that they have list and they'll list potential traumas, you certainly can ask children a series of yes/no questions about trauma, but really I think what you'd want to do is flip back to something like the protocol where you're following them up with open-ended questions to kind of gauge more details about what actually happened, how involved children were, how they felt, to find out information in their own words. In addition, a lot of these other protocols don't really give specific guidance on this idea of narrative rapport building. And I think that what's really challenging is to establish that context at first of children being the sources of information and knowledge, and hence being able to provide information to others. So it's not that those other questionnaires like the HTQ or the TESI are bad at all. They're just not designed to kind of teach children how to talk.
Yeah. So I think we need to turn it over to Anna for her finishing thoughts.
Yep, thank you very much to our panelists for such a wonderful presentation, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. If you're interested in future webinars, please see the information on this slide. If you're interested in helping to plan a webinar or to join the listserv to receive notifications about future webinars, a quarterly newsletter, as well as other job and event announcements, in my follow-up email, I will attach a copy of today's slides and link to today's webinar, which will be posted to SRCD's YouTube channel. Thank you again to everyone for joining us, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.